Joshua, towards the very end, as Joshua is nearing his death. Then Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem, and summoned the elders, the heads, the judges, and the officers of Israel, and they presented themselves before God. And Joshua said to all the people, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, long ago your ancestors Terah and his sons Abraham and Nahor lived beyond the Euphrates and served other gods. Then I took your father Abraham from beyond the river and led him through all the land of Canaan and made his offspring many. I gave him Isaac, and to Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau. I gave Esau the hill country of Seir to possess, but Jacob and his children went down to Egypt. Then I sent Moses and Aaron, and I plagued Egypt with what I did in its midst, and afterwards I brought you out. When I brought your ancestors out of Egypt, you came to the sea, and the Egyptian pursued your ancestors with chariots and horsemen to the Red Sea. When they cried out to the Lord, he put darkness between you and the Egyptians, and made the sea come upon them and cover them, and your eyes saw what I did to Egypt. Afterward, you lived in the wilderness a long time. Then I brought you to the land of the Amorites, who lived on the other side of the Jordan. They fought with you, and I handed them over to you, and you took possession of their land, and I destroyed them before you. Then King Balak, son of Zippor of Moab, set out to fight against Israel. He sent and invited Balaam, son of Beor, to curse you. But I would not listen to Balaam. Therefore, he blessed you. So I rescued you out of his hand. When you went over the Jordan and came to Jericho, the citizens of Jericho fought against you, and also the Amorites. Just, aren't you glad you don't have to read those last 3 lines here? So I'll give it the best I've got here. So, back to, so Jericho fought against you, also the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Girgasites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, and I handed them over to you. I set the hornet ahead of you, which drove out before you the 2 kings of the Amorites. It was not by your sword or your bow. I gave you a land on which you have not labored, and towns that you have not built, and you live in them. You eat the fruit of the vineyard and olive yards that you have not planted. Now therefore, revere the Lord, and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your ancestors served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. Now, if you are unwilling to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your ancestors served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So we have Joshua giving this great big speech, and this is just a part of the speech that he gave. It seems that all of the great characters of the Old Testament get to give a big speech right before they die. And most of what they talk about is what God has done in the life of the Israelites, or in the life of their, in their own life, in the life of the world. They get to kind of summarize all of that and remind us of God's doings in the world. And this was Joshua's last big speech. He was recounting what God had done for him and for all of Israel. And the book of Joshua, if you sat down to read it, is a book that's terribly disturbing. At least to us, it's deeply disturbing. It's one where war and violence are everyday activities. You heard in the reading a recitation of God helping Israel conquer people after people after people. And it's easy for us to be disturbed about stories like this. It's easy to be disturbed because we live such sheltered lives compared to them. Not that we live sheltered lives completely, not that we're immune to violence or war or people that we love or ourselves going off to war. But it seems to me that in this time and place that Joshua is speaking, war and violence are everywhere. And so where is God to meet the people except in their everyday lives? And their everyday lives included violence and war. And that is where God meets them. For them, it's a way of life, and God shows up in the midst of their lives. Listen again to the people that were conquered, and tell me if you've heard about them except here in this one verse or one chapter of the Bible. You know what? I'm not going to read all of those names again. It's too hard. You heard the name of 5 or 6, maybe 7 or 8 different groups of people. Clans. People that owned the land or inherited the land and had established themselves in the land. God says to the Israelite people, you eat from vineyards and olive yards that you did not plant, olive orchards that you didn't plant. You lived in houses and cities that you didn't build. But God pushed all of those people out. They were either killed or they were assimilated into the Israelite way of life. We would think of that as horrible for some country to decide that we need all of that country over there and just to march right through with the armies, with the help of God, to take over somebody else's land. Not our way of life, but it was their way of life. And how did they respond? How did they respond when Joshua reminded them of all the things that God had done in their lives? Bringing them out of Egypt, giving them Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and the rest of the sons, giving them now a place to call their own, a place of safety, a place of abundance, a place where they can put down their own roots and call it home. Well, first Joshua encourages them by saying, whose gods will you follow? Now that you've heard the recitation of what God has done in our lives, what God are you going to follow? Are you going to follow the gods from the other side of the Euphrates, where Abraham and his family lived many, many years ago? Are you going to follow the God of the Amorites? Are you going to follow the God of the Perizzites, the Gigabites, those people? Choose. Choose, he says. Choose a God to follow. And follow that God with all of your heart and mind and soul and body and strength. And he says, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And he says, who do you choose? And the people answered, far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. For it is the Lord our God who brought us and our ancestors up from the land of Egypt out of the house of slavery, and who did those great signs in our sight. He protected us along the way, and we went out and among all the peoples through whom we passed, and the Lord drove out before us all the peoples, the Amorites who lived in the land. Therefore, we also will serve the Lord, for he is our God. So as I said, they lived in a time and a place of violence and war. But Jesus came and changed that. Jesus came and changed people's perception of what God was all about, and changed their perception of how it is that God works within and through and for the people of God. And Jesus came and changed even the definition of who the people of God were. When Jesus came, it was no longer just the Israelites, but it was all people. If there were any more Hittites around, they were also chosen and named as God's people. And by extension, we are chosen to be God's people. As I told the kids, it's God who chooses us, not us who choose God. And everyone is chosen by God. It's just a matter of finally recognizing and realizing that God has already chosen us. So what is all this historical background that I've given, that the verses have given us for the Israelite people in the time of Jacob? What does that have to do with us? Well, it should make us look back on our own past and see where it is that God has been incredibly present in our lives and in the lives of this church. And I've been here 8 years now, so that's just a short period of time in the life of this church. This church has been here for 65, 66 years, somewhere in that number. So for a long time. And the church, for those that have been here for a long time, has had its ups and downs, hasn't it? And there are places where we could look back and see God's hand was upon this church in a special way. God's hand is always upon this church and this place and this people. But we can look back and see through new pastors, through new buildings, through new programs, that God's hand has been active in the life of this church. And God has seen this church through the ups and downs. And now, in 2018, we look around and we say, where are all the people? How come there's so many empty pews? But I think we get it wrong when we start to judge solely on how many people are here. What God cares about even more than how many people are here. Don't get me wrong, God would love to see this place jammed full of people. But what God is most interested in is, are we changing lives? Is being here changing your life and my life? Is being a part of this church changing the lives of people outside of this church? Can we see God's hand being active still in the life and people of this church? And I say with a resounding yes, God's hand is still active and still wonderful and still almighty and worthy of our praise and worthy of our response. As we can see from the lesson that we read, from Jacob or Joshua, recounting all the things and deeds of God in a very short period, in a very short couple of paragraphs, we should do the same. Again, we should look back and see what has happened in this church, but we should also see how God has been active in our own lives. How God has changed us for the better. How God has sent His Holy Spirit to fill us so that we can fill others. One of the best ways to be a witness for God, for that is what Joshua was doing, was being a witness for God. One of the best ways is to be able to point out places where we see God in action. Not bragging about our own actions, but seeing actions of others and pointing to that as God present. When I think about yesterday in this church with 100 people, many of them young people, and reading together a litany of blessing for the walk, I saw God's hand at work in all of those people. Not only the 100 plus that walked, but in probably 10 or 12 others that helped with registration, and we had 2 water stations along the way, and the people that did those. We saw God's hand at work yesterday. And we can see God's hand at work all the time. We just want to keep practicing and practicing. When we see something good happen, call it God's work. And give praise for what you see happening. So in this text, we saw a renewal of God's covenant. In the past several weeks, we've seen God give a covenant with Noah that no longer, never again, will the whole world be destroyed. And God reminded Himself that that was His promise by placing the rainbow in the sky. And we heard about God coming to Abraham and promising a people, a nation, descendants more than the stars in the sky and the sand on the beach. And God promised to be with that people. And that people includes us. So can we be a people that renews the covenant with God? Can we be the people that say the same words that Joshua said? Read it. Can you say it with me? As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. That's That's individuals. That was Joshua saying that, and that's important for us to say, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. But it's also important, as I read the verses just following our text for today, the whole people of Israel said this, so as not individuals, but as the community. Let us renew our covenant with these words. Therefore, we also will serve the Lord, for he is our God. Amen. Let's stand and sing.